The sea was on fire. From horizon to shore, the waters around Okinawa boiled with explosions. Geysers of white spray rising from shells that fell too short, others smashing directly into the surf where men were trying to live long enough to crawl forward. The smoke clung to the waves like oil, thick and choking, twisting the daylight into something that looked like dusk. Private Daniel Raines gripped the side of his landing craft so tightly his knuckles split beneath his gloves. He could feel the tremor of the engines beneath his boots, could taste salt and diesel on his tongue. Ahead of him, a dozen other Higgins boats formed a jagged line, their ramps aimed toward the black outline of Okinawa. 30 seconds, the coxswain shouted, his voice barely piercing the thunder of naval guns behind them. Daniel's stomach turned. He had landed before, Peleliu, barely a year ago, but this was different. The entire world seemed to be made of artillery. He checked his rifle again, though he knew it was pointless. Beside him, Corporal Jennings crossed himself and whispered a name Daniel didn't catch. The ramp dropped with a crash, and the sea rushed in like a monster's breath. They ran into hell. Beneath the same beach, Captain Hiroshi Tanaka waited in silence, the air around him heavy with the taste of earth and oil. The tunnel walls dripped with condensation, the faint sound of artillery echoing through the stone like distant thunder. His men, what was left of the 62nd Division, crouched in darkness, rifles cradled in their arms. "Wait," Tanaka whispered as the ground shook again. "Do not fire until they are on the sand." He could hear the voices of the Americans above, faint through the vents, the shouts, the waves, the chaos. His hand tightened on his katana, not as a symbol, but as a reminder. He had promised his wife he would never be taken alive. A runner stumbled into the chamber. "Sir, the first line has been breached." Tanaka closed his eyes. It had begun. "Then we hold the second," he said quietly, "for as long as we can." He moved to the periscope embedded into the wall, its lens smeared with grime. Through it, he saw the black smoke rising from the beach, the silhouettes of men moving through flame and surf. They were unstoppable, wave after wave, like the tide itself. But every inch they gained would cost them blood. On the surface, Daniel's world had narrowed to movement and survival. The sand erupted around him as machine guns opened from hidden cliffs. The man to his right went down, his helmet spinning away into the water. "Forward!" an officer screamed, waving his pistol toward the ridge. "Get off the beach!" Daniel crawled behind a burned-out tank, his heart hammering so loud he could barely hear. The tank's gun barrel pointed uselessly toward the sea, the rest of its crew dead beside it. He looked up the slope and saw nothing. No enemy, only smoke and the smell of death. And then the ground beneath him exploded. He woke seconds later, ears ringing, sand filling his mouth. A medic dragged him backward toward a line of hastily dug trenches. "Keep your head down, Doreen," the medic shouted. Daniel tried to speak, but his words were drowned out by another shell. Behind him, the naval bombardment resumed, shaking the entire island. To his left, a wave of tanks rolled forward, their treads grinding the coral into white dust. The Marines followed, ghosts in the smoke. Above them, the sky darkened as planes swept in low, dropping payloads that shook the mountains. But the Japanese did not retreat. They waited. Deep below, Captain Tanaka felt the mountain itself shudder. One of his men crossed himself in silence. Another whispered a prayer to his ancestors. Tanaka allowed himself one brief thought of his son, who would be 12 now, perhaps standing in a schoolyard back in Tokyo, watching the sky for bombers. He pushed the thought away. There was no room left for dreams, only duty. He gave the signal. The tunnels came alive, hidden gun ports opening like eyes in the rock, mortars thudding, machine guns spitting death into the smoke. The defenders, buried and unseen, tore through the advancing Marines with precision fire.
For every yard of ground the Americans gained, 10 men fell. Tanaka whispered, "We will make them pay for every inch." He meant it. From the sea, Commander Lewis, aboard the destroyer USS Halloran, watched through binoculars, jaw clenched. "God help them," he murmured. "Sir, the bombardment is barely denting those caves," an officer said beside him. Lewis nodded grimly. He had seen this before. Peleliu, Iwajima. The same story, the same stubborn enemy who refused to surrender. He lowered the binoculars. "Then we'll keep firing," he said, "until there's nothing left to fire at." The guns spoke again, shaking the ocean. Below the island, Tanaka's candle flickered. He exhaled slowly, then whispered to himself, "The sea brings them, but the mountain will bury them." Outside, the ground burned. The rain came on the second night, a slow, relentless drizzle that turned the beachhead into a swamp of mud and oil, where corpses floated half-buried, and the air reeked of cordite and rot. The Marines called it Death's Tide. Private Daniel Raines sat beneath a torn poncho, cleaning his rifle by candlelight while artillery rumbled miles inland. He had barely slept since the landing. Every few minutes, flares burst in the sky like dying stars, illuminating the twisted remains of landing craft and tanks still smoldering in the surf. Corporal Jennings sat beside him, chewing on a strip of canned meat. "You think they're all dead up there?" Daniel shook his head. "Not a chance. They're waiting for us." Jennings spat into the mud. "That figures. They always are." Further down the line, stretcher-bearers moved silently between trenches, carrying what the others tried not to look at. Daniel glanced toward the inland ridge, Shuri Line, the intelligence brief had called it, a web of bunkers and caves carved into limestone. Somewhere in that maze, the Japanese waited, patient and invisible. He thought of home, a farm outside Kansas City, a sister who sent him letters that smelled faintly of lavender. He hadn't written her back in weeks. There wasn't anything left to say that wouldn't sound like a lie. Far below that same ridge, Captain Tanaka studied his map by lantern light. The humidity made the paper soft and the ink bleed. Around him, the walls trembled with each American shell that struck the outer defenses. His adjutant, Lieutenant Morita, leaned over the table. "Sir, the coastal defense is nearly gone. Our losses are severe." Tanaka didn't answer at first. He traced a finger across the map, a network of tunnels running from the cliffs to the inland valley. Every position was numbered, every name familiar. Too many had already been crossed out. "How long until the Americans reach Line 2? He asked. 2, perhaps 3 days. Tanaka nodded slowly. "Then we have 2 days of life above ground." He turned to the small group of officers huddled in the dim light. Their faces were streaked with soot and exhaustion. He said quietly, "We fight until we are destroyed. The Emperor depends on our resolve. Remember that the soul of Japan is not measured by victory, but by sacrifice." The men bowed. None spoke. When they left, Tanaka sat alone for a long time, listening to the faint trickle of water through the rock. From his pocket, he pulled a folded photograph. His wife and son, smiling in the garden before he'd shipped out. The edges were worn from years of battle. He whispered, Forgive me, Aya." Then he folded the photo and blew out the lantern. By dawn, the Marines were moving inland. The tanks crawled forward in pairs, their treads throwing mud like waves. Infantry followed close, rifles raised, eyes fixed on the tree line ahead. Daniel walked with second platoon, his boots sinking with every step. The jungle loomed in front of them, dark and silent.
"Feels wrong," Jennings muttered. "Yeah," Daniel said. "They're out there." He was right. The first explosion came from the ridge, a hidden mine, triggered as a Sherman tank rolled past. The blast tore the vehicle in half, throwing bodies and metal into the trees. "Ambush!" someone screamed. The hillside erupted. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery fire poured from unseen positions. Daniel dove behind a fallen log as bullets shredded the leaves above him. He saw Jennings firing blindly into the smoke, shouting something Daniel couldn't hear. Then a mortar landed behind them, and the world became dust and fire. When Daniel opened his eyes, everything was red. Jennings was gone. Inside the tunnel network, Tanaka could hear the echo of his men's victory cries. One ambush among hundreds, perfectly timed and executed. He closed his eyes. Every successful defense meant more blood on both sides. Morita entered, carrying a battered field phone. "Headquarters reports heavy enemy casualties," he said. "Our gunners are requesting more ammunition." Tanaka looked at the dwindling stacks of crates. "There is no more. Tell them to use sparingly." He walked to the ventilation shaft, listening to the distant thunder of battle. Each explosion shook dust from the ceiling. Morita hesitated. "Captain, if they take the line, what then?" Tanaka turned slowly. "Then we move deeper underground, and we wait for the next assault." His tone carried no fear, only exhaustion that had long since turned to acceptance. 3 days later, the Americans reached the first ridge. They had lost hundreds to reach it, but the hill finally fell silent. Smoke coiled upward from the shattered bunkers. The Marines advanced cautiously, checking each tunnel and trench. Daniel moved through the ruins with his squad, rifle raised. The stench was unbearable. Burned flesh, rotting food, and the sweet tang of decay. In one bunker, they found bodies stacked neatly, each covered with a Japanese flag. Some had grenades clutched to their chests. Lieutenant Harris removed his helmet. "They'd rather die than surrender," he said quietly. Daniel stared at the faces of the dead, boys no older than himself. He wondered if their mothers had also sent letters that smelled like lavender. That night, a storm rolled in from the sea. Rain hammered the camp as Marines huddled beneath makeshift tarps. Radios crackled with static. Daniel sat by a lantern, cleaning his rifle again out of habit. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the hillside, Jennings disappearing into fire, the silent faces in the bunker. A voice broke his thoughts. "Mind if I sit?" He looked up to see Sergeant Evelyn Hart, one of the few female war correspondents attached to the unit. Her uniform was soaked, her notepad wrapped in oilcloth. "Sure," Daniel said. She sat beside him, lighting a cigarette. "You've seen it before, right?" She said. "Peleliu, right?" He nodded. "Then you know this isn't over. They're waiting further inland, whole cities under the ground." Daniel glanced at her. "How do you know?" She exhaled smoke into the rain. "Because I've seen their maps, and because they don't fight to win, they fight to die." Daniel said nothing. The thunder rolled over them like distant artillery.
Below, Tanaka's men were moving deeper into the mountain. The second line of defense was ready, chambers connected by tunnels stocked with food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Dr. Sato, the unit's medic, worked silently over the wounded. The air stank of blood and disinfectant. Tanaka approached him. "How many casualties?" "Too many," Sato said without looking up, "and no morphine left." Tanaka nodded, his expression unreadable. "Do what you can." He turned back toward the command chamber. "Lieutenant Morita, send word to headquarters. We will begin the next phase at dawn." Morita hesitated. "Sir, what is the next phase?" Tanaka met his eyes. "Total resistance." Days became weeks. The Marines fought for every ridge, every cave, every foot of ground. The Japanese never surrendered. Even the wounded crawled out of tunnels to throw grenades beneath tanks. The ground itself seemed alive with fire. Daniel learned to stop counting the dead. He stopped thinking about home. There was only the next trench, the next hill, the next order to move. One night, he found Sergeant Hart sitting alone near the cliff edge, writing by candlelight. "What do you write about?" he asked. "People," she said softly. "The ones who still believe this will end." He smiled faintly. "You think it will?" She didn't answer. She just looked out at the dark sea where the ships flickered like distant stars. In his tunnel, Captain Tanaka listened to the radio static fade. Communication with higher command had gone silent. He realized then what he had known all along. No help would come. They were alone. He looked at the photo of his family once more. For Japan, and for them. Then he ordered the tunnels sealed behind him. The mountains swallowed their voices. The battle had become a siege. By mid-April, the American forces had taken the southern ridges, but the Japanese line still held deep beneath the hills. What looked like victory above ground was only the beginning of a nightmare below. Every morning, the Marines climbed into valleys that had already been cleared twice, only to find snipers waiting. Every night, the Japanese launched suicidal counterattacks from tunnels that no one could find. The rain never stopped. It filled the foxholes and washed away the graves. The mud swallowed Nen whole. Daniel Rains no longer felt fear the way he used to. It had become something duller, a steady ache behind his ribs. He moved through each day as if underwater, his mind focused only on the next order, the next hill, the next breath. He and Sergeant Hart had fallen into a quiet rhythm. She recorded what she could. He tried not to let her see what he couldn't forget. One afternoon, while their unit waited for an airstrike to soften the next ridge, Hart approached him, notebook in hand. "Mind a few questions, Private?" she asked. He looked up from his rifle. "About what?" "About you." Daniel almost laughed. "What's there to say? I shoot, I crawl, I try not to die." She studied him for a moment, her pencil poised above the page. "That's not what people back home want to hear." "Then maybe they shouldn't ask." Hart didn't write. She simply nodded, then looked toward the horizon where the sky pulsed with distant flashes. "You ever think they're watching this? Your family?" Daniel hesitated. "No, I don't think they'd understand it if they did." Beneath them, Captain Tanaka and his men lived like ghosts. The tunnels had grown damp and airless. The wounded lay in side chambers, their groans blending with the steady drip of water from the limestone ceiling. Dr. Sato moved between them, his face pale with exhaustion. He had run out of morphine days ago. The smell of infection clung to him like smoke. Tanaka entered the chamber quietly. "How are they?" Sato didn't look up, dying slowly. "Is there anything more we can do?" "Yes," Sato said flatly. "End it quickly, but you wouldn't allow that." Tanaka's expression hardened. "Their deaths must mean something." Sato turned then, his eyes hollow. "And what does it mean, Captain? That they suffer longer?" The silence between them was heavy. Tanaka wanted to answer, to say that honor was the only thing left, that Japan's spirit demanded this endurance, but the words felt smaller than the truth pressing in from the walls. He walked away without replying. Above ground, Daniel's platoon advanced toward the southern valley. Intelligence said the Japanese were nearly broken. Daniel didn't believe it. As they reached a burned-out village, the smell hit first. Smoke, rot, and something metallic. Bodies lay among the ruins, both civilian and soldier. Sergeant Hart walked slowly through the wreckage, camera in hand. "God," she whispered, "they used to live here." Daniel stopped beside a broken cart where a doll lay half buried in mud. He knelt and brushed the dirt away. Its porcelain face was cracked, the painted eyes staring upward. He said, "War doesn't care who used to live anywhere." Hart looked at him sharply. "You say that like you've stopped caring too." He didn't answer. That night, the Marines bivouacked on the edge of the valley. Rain came again, heavier this time, turning the camp into a swamp. Daniel shared a foxhole with Private Ortiz, a 17-year-old replacement who still talked about baseball and girls as if those things were real. Ortiz whispered, "You think they'll surrender soon?" Daniel shook his head. "They don't surrender." "Then how do we win?" Daniel stared into the darkness. "By surviving longer than they do." Deep underground, Tanaka faced his own doubts. Lieutenant Morita approached him with a message from headquarters, though headquarters now was nothing more than a radio signal relayed through collapsing tunnels. "They say we are to fight until every man is dead," Morita said. Tanaka closed his eyes. "We already are." He looked around at his men. Hollow-eyed soldiers crouched in the flickering lamplight, eating cold rice with trembling hands. Many had stopped speaking altogether. He knew morale was cracking. The Emperor's orders felt distant here, buried under stone and despair. That night, Tanaka wrote a letter he would never send. "To my wife Aya, if you read this, it means I am gone. Tell our son that his father fought, not because he hated, but because he believed his duty was to protect what little beauty remained in the world. I pray that he will live to see a Japan without war, without men like me." He folded it carefully, placed it inside his tunic, and returned to the command post. By late April, the Americans discovered the scale of the tunnel network. Engineers began flooding caves with fuel, setting them ablaze. Daniel's platoon was ordered to clear one such system near Hill 89. The entrance was a jagged opening at the base of a ridge, half hidden by debris. The air that came out smelled of death. Sergeant Harris gave the order, flamethrowers first, then grenades. Daniel followed the team into the mouth of the cave, his flashlight cutting through the dark. Inside, the walls were slick, the floor littered with debris and bones. When they reached the first chamber, he saw movement. A wounded Japanese soldier, barely conscious, clutching a photograph in one hand. Daniel froze. The man looked up at him, eyes filled not with fear, but recognition, as if he'd seen Daniel in a dream. Then the soldier pulled the pin from a grenade. Daniel shouted, dove behind a rock, and the explosion filled the cave with fire and dust. When he came to, his ears rang, his arm burned, and the soldier was gone. Nothing left but the scorched photo fluttering near the wall. He picked it up. A woman and child smiled back from the ash. In his own tunnel, Tanaka received word that another outpost had been destroyed by fire. "How many?" he asked. 36 men, sir," Morita replied, "burned alive." Tanaka's jaw tightened. "Then we retaliate. Sir, our ammunition, use what remains." He stared at the map, a line of fading ink that no longer matched reality. They take the surface, we take their sleep. That night,
Tanaka led a raid through the tunnels that opened behind enemy lines. His men emerged from the ground like ghosts, knives and bayonets flashing in the rain. The Marines never saw them coming. Daniel awoke to screams, the camp in chaos, flares turning the night red. He grabbed his rifle and fired into the dark, shapes moving between the tents. When it was over, dozens were dead on both sides. The attackers had vanished back into the earth. Daniel found Sergeant Hart crouched behind a jeep, shaking but alive. Her camera was shattered at her feet. "They came from nowhere," she said. Daniel looked at the ground, at the open cracks between rocks. "Not nowhere," he said quietly. "They live under our feet." 2 days later, Daniel's platoon found one of the tunnel entrances. The engineers sealed it with explosives. The mountain shook as it collapsed, burying hundreds inside. Tanaka was among them. The ceiling fell in sections, crushing men and sealing corridors. The lights went out. When the dust settled, only a handful survived. Tanaka, Morita, and a few wounded soldiers trapped in total darkness. "Sir, we're cut off," Morita whispered. Tanaka listened to the silence pressing from all sides. He could hear faint screams in the distance, muffled by rock. "Then we will make our stand here," he said. Above, Daniel watched the smoke rise from the sealed hill. Hart stood beside him. "Do you think they were all killed?" Daniel lowered his helmet. "No," he said. "They'll keep fighting, even down there." Hart closed her notebook. "Then this will never end." Daniel didn't disagree. He simply watched the smoke fade into the rain, thinking of the photo he still carried in his pocket, the one he'd found in that cave. A woman and a child smiling. Somewhere, maybe, still waiting. He wondered if the man who'd held it was still alive, buried beneath the same hill Daniel now stood on. The rain did not stop. It came in sheets, drumming against helmets, soaking through uniforms, turning every inch of Okinawa into a graveyard of mud. By May, the American forces had lost count of how many ridges they'd taken, how many had been retaken, and how many times they had to clear the same cave twice. Daniel Raines was no longer the boy who'd landed on the beach weeks ago. The skin under his helmet was raw from salt and sweat, and the tremor in his left hand hadn't left since Hill 89. He still carried the scorched photograph inside his breast pocket, a reminder of something he didn't fully understand. Sergeant Evelyn Hart had stopped writing. Her notebook lay in the corner of the tent, pages warped from rain and blood. The war no longer needed documenting, it needed surviving. That morning, Captain Avery assembled what was left of the platoon. "New orders," he said. "We're pushing south, Shuri Line." The men exchanged weary looks. Everyone knew the name. The Shuri Line was supposed to be impregnable, a labyrinth of fortified ridges, bunkers, and tunnels where the Japanese made their final stand. Daniel's stomach turned cold. "How far?" he asked. "Far enough to see hell up close," Avery said. "Pack light."
Daniel's platoon reached the southern slope of Shuri by the end of May, what was left of it anyway, fewer than 20 men. He sat apart from the others, helmet off, rain washing over his mud-streaked face. In his hand was the scorched photograph. He'd unfolded it so many times the edges were tearing. A woman, a child, a man in uniform. He wondered again who they were, and why he, of all people, had been the one to find them. Lieutenant Harris sat beside him, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. "You've been quiet, Raines." Nothing left to say. You fought well back there. You did her proud. Daniel looked up. Who? The reporter, Hart. Harris exhaled smoke. She told me you'd stop believing in this war. Guess she was wrong. Daniel didn't answer. He stared into the fog until the cigarette burned out between the lieutenant's fingers. Far beneath their feet, Tanaka sat in the dark, counting breaths. He had lost track of time. Days? Weeks? The water was gone. The air stank of decay. One by one, the others had stopped moving. Only Morita remained, whispering to himself in delirium. Sir, maybe the Americans are right. Maybe we should have surrendered. Tanaka turned his head, eyes hollow. There is no surrender in the dark. Morita chuckled weakly. Then maybe we're already dead. Tanaka looked toward the faint outline of the wall where the entrance used to be. If we are, then let us die as men, not ghosts. He took out his pistol. For a long time he stared at it, not with fear, but with the calm of a man who had already made peace with the inevitable. He thought of his wife, his son, the garden behind their home where plum blossoms fell every spring. He placed the barrel under his chin. And then, faintly through the rock, came a sound. Not explosions this time, not artillery. Voices. American voices. He froze. Above ground, Daniel's unit had been ordered to clear the last tunnel complex on the southern ridge. Intelligence said the remaining Japanese garrison numbered less than 50. As Daniel descended into the newly blasted entrance, his flashlight beam caught fragments of uniforms, shattered helmets, and bones. The deeper they went, the hotter the air became. He reached the final chamber and stopped. In the corner, slumped against the wall, was a man in a tattered Japanese officer's coat. His eyes were open, but unseeing. His hand still clutched a pistol. Daniel stepped closer, kneeling beside him. There, tucked inside the man's uniform, was a folded paper, a letter. He opened it carefully, reading by the dim light. To my wife, Aya, and my son, Kenji, I fight not for victory, but for remembrance. When the world forgets our names, let them at least remember that we endured. Forgive me for leaving you this way. Daniel's breath caught. His hand went to his pocket. He unfolded the scorched photograph. The same woman and child. It was him. The man from the photo. Daniel sat there for a long time, staring at the letter, the dead officer, and the truth between them. Daniel's platoon reached the southern slope of Shuri by the end of May, what was left of it anyway, fewer than 20 men. He sat apart from the others, helmet off, rain washing over his mud-streaked face. In his hand was the scorched photograph. He'd unfolded it so many times the edges were tearing. A woman, a child, a man in uniform. He wondered again who they were, and why he, of all people, had been the one to find them. Lieutenant Harris sat beside him, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. You've been quiet, Rains. Nothing left to say. You fought well back there. You did her proud. Daniel looked up. Who? The reporter, Hart. Harris exhaled smoke. She told me you'd stop believing in this war. Guess she was wrong. Daniel didn't answer. He stared into the fog until the cigarette burned out between the lieutenant's fingers. Far beneath their feet, Tanaka sat in the dark, counting breaths. He had lost track of time. Days? Weeks? The water was gone. The air stank of decay. One by one, the others had stopped moving. Only Morita remained, whispering to himself in delirium. "Sir, maybe the Americans are right. Maybe we should have surrendered." Tanaka turned his head, eyes hollow. "There is no surrender in the dark." Morita chuckled weakly. "Then maybe we're already dead." Tanaka looked toward the faint outline of the wall where the entrance used to be. "If we are, then let us die as men, not ghosts." He took out his pistol. For a long time he stared at it, not with fear, but with the calm of a man who had already made peace with the inevitable. He thought of his wife, his son, the garden behind their home where plum blossoms fell every spring. He placed the barrel under his chin. And then, faintly through the rock, came a sound. Not explosions this time, not artillery. Voices. American voices. He froze. Above ground, Daniel's unit had been ordered to clear the last tunnel complex on the southern ridge. Intelligence said the remaining Japanese garrison numbered less than 50. As Daniel descended into the newly blasted entrance, his flashlight beam caught fragments of uniforms, shattered helmets, and bones. The deeper they went, the hotter the air became. He reached the final chamber and stopped. In the corner, slumped against the wall, was a man in a tattered Japanese officer's coat. His eyes were open, but unseeing. His hand still clutched a pistol. Daniel stepped closer, kneeling beside him. There, tucked inside the man's uniform, was a folded paper, a letter. He opened it carefully, reading by the dim light. "To my wife, Aya, and my son, Kenji, I fight not for victory, but for remembrance. When the world forgets our names, let them at least remember that we endured. Forgive me for leaving you this way." Daniel's breath caught. His hand went to his pocket. He unfolded the scorched photograph, the same woman and child. It was him, the man from the photo. Daniel sat there for a long time, staring at the letter, the dead officer, and the truth between them.
Years passed. The world changed. Jet engines replaced propellers. Cities rebuilt. Maps were redrawn. But Daniel Rains never forgot Okinawa. He visited the war memorials, though rarely spoke to anyone there. He preferred to stand quietly, hands clasped behind his back, eyes on the carved names. On his final visit, decades later, he returned to Okinawa itself. The island was unrecognizable, green again, peaceful, alive with tourists and schoolchildren. Where the tunnels once ran, there were now gardens and shrines. He walked alone through the Peace Memorial Park, past the rows of black granite tablets engraved with names: American, Japanese, Okinawan, all side by side. A local caretaker noticed him lingering before one tablet longer than the rest. "Were you here during the war?" the man asked in halting English. Daniel nodded. "A long time ago." The caretaker smiled softly. "Many soldiers come back, some to find peace, some to leave it here." Daniel touched the name etched before him. Hiroshi Tanaka. "I think I came for both," he said. A warm breeze swept through the trees, stirring the flags and paper cranes tied to the railings.
Daniel took something from his pocket, the dried plum blossom, now fragile as ash, and placed it at the base of the stone. "Rest easy, Captain. They remember." For the first time in years, he felt the weight in his chest ease. Not gone, but lighter, like a promise finally kept. That evening, as the sun sank into the East China Sea, Daniel sat on a bench overlooking the waves. Children were laughing nearby, chasing each other through the grass. Their laughter rose above the wind, bright, free, alive. He smiled faintly. "That's what we fought for," he thought. "Not land, not flags, the right for children to laugh again." He closed his eyes and let the wind carry the sound away. Behind him, a stone monument bore an inscription in both languages. "War destroys. Memory heals. May the dead of all nations sleep in the same peace."